segue into Albert Breer, the Monday morning quarterback who joins us on the program. So what do you make of that? Could you see a day where Robert Kraft fires Bill Belichick?
Well, first of all, let me just tell you that you're speaking to a man whose wife just bought a 12-foot skeleton to put on our front lawn. So
How much
I
did a
told her
12-foot skeleton cost?
Oh, well, no, it was so there's this like little cul-de-sac, like a couple blocks down or a couple driveways down from our house. And every year on Halloween, they did the coolest display. It's like 3 or 4 people that live on it, and they did the most unbelievable display. Well, the couple that organizes it is getting older, and so they decided this was going to be the year they'd stop doing it. So they have like a big yard sale of all their Halloween stuff. So sure enough, my wife goes in there and she comes out with an old school TV with like a blood handprint on it that only plays Poltergeist, right? A big trick or treat sign, and then this 12-foot skeleton, which of course I was responsible for carrying down the street.
I like it.
Probably great. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. So I told her I'm like, if this keeps up, you're gonna probably try to turn me into Clark Griswold for Christmas. So yeah, and I'll take the hard left turn now here to Bill Belichick's job status. I've felt like, Robert Kraft has this term elegant solution or elegant conclusion. And, I think he would prefer that with Bill. Like, I think he would prefer that it end in a way where he's able to give Bill his brass ring and send him off into the sunset. And, I don't think Bill wants to be done coaching after this year. And so I think, what I've felt like for a while now is what would hasten his departure wouldn't be just a flat out firing. It would be your football operation is messed up. We need a restructure. We're going to restructure when you leave anyway, because no coach gets that much power. So instead of doing it after you leave, we're going to do it now. And we're going to bring in a personnel man. And that personnel man is going to report to me, not to you. You're still going to report to me, but we're going to set this up differently because we don't feel like you've done a good enough job putting talent on the roster over the last 5 years. And then it might be up to Bill, and in that case, it would be, do you want to be part of this or not? And ironically enough, like that's what hastened the departure of Bill Parcells. If you remember, they took personnel power away from him in 1996. There was the whole Terry Glenn thing, and then he walked in 97. And so would Bill have an appetite for coming back under a different structure with a general manager who doesn't answer to him?
Interesting.
I felt like all along, like that was the more likely conclusion if this season didn't go right. But I didn't foresee them losing by 30 2 weeks in a row. So, I think everything might be on the table now.
Gut feeling. How does this end?
My gut feeling is they're not good enough this year, that the roster is just flat out not good enough. You know what the best way to illustrate it is, Dan? Look at the roster. Tell me what player you can say is going to be there 5 years from now. One player. Christian Gonzalez. Who's been there for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the sort of disrepair the roster is in right now. And, so I don't think they're good enough. I think that this is probably at best a 6 or 7 win team. I don't think that's going to be good enough for Robert Kraft. And I think they're going to be at a crossroads at the end of the year. And I don't think if things play out that way, if it's 6 or 7 wins, I don't think Robert Kraft is going to be satisfied to run it back the same way it is now in 2024. And I think that would lead to difficult conversations. And I mean, it's certainly possible. The conclusion could be that Bill Belichick's no longer the coach in 2024. And, it's almost hard to envision that scenario. It would have been, if you had said that before the year or a couple of years ago, certainly, but that's where the roster is. That's where this season seems to be going. And, I think it was interesting this morning. I think Bill said in his press conference, I might not have this quote exactly right, but I think he said something along the lines of like, the Raiders have 5 of the top players in the league at their positions, which is probably true. It was almost like, so what are you saying about yourself by just bringing that up on your own?
Yeah.
And are you pointing the finger somewhere else, even though you're the one who had control over all of this? It's just, I don't know. It's just a weird deal there now.
Yeah, that the Raiders have guys at their position. Then I would ask Bill, how many players do you have at their position that they're the best in the league? And I don't know if he'd answer it, but I
You
do.
probably wouldn't, but I mean, you look at it and it's like, it's true. I mean, it's just they don't have premier talent, and I think the overriding thing is they're still operating like it was 10 years ago. Like I have a guy I'm pretty close with who used to be in the division, an NFL executive who said to me, it feels, and I think this is the best way to put it, it's like Bill is fighting the last war of his way, and he's kept doing things his way despite the league continuing to move in different directions. And his way for so long was supported by some tent poles in the organization. Like if you're not as good on the offensive line, Brady will get rid of the ball a little faster. If you're not as good at receiver, Brady will throw the ball into a little bit of a tighter window. If you can't run the ball as well, Brady can make up for that in the passing game. If you don't play defense as well, Brady will win shootouts. So there's that. Then, you go beyond just the level of having the greatest player of all time. It's like they built the offensive line this year like Dante Scarnecchia was still there. And it's really hard to ask a first-year offensive line coach coming in to perform at that level. And Dante Scarnecchia turned a college wrestler into a Pro Bowl guard, and he was able to make things work so many times with less talent up there. They're still operating like Dante Scarnecchia is there when the rest of the league spends top 10 picks to go get left tackles,
Mm-hmm.
And so there are so many of these spots that they're left short at. And it's almost like they're under the spell. Well, it'll work itself out. It doesn't work that way, Bill. You got to put good players at those spots. And the best players have good players at premium positions. The way the Rams won a Super Bowl, was with Matt Stafford at quarterback, Cooper Kupp at receiver, Andrew Whitworth at left tackle, Aaron Donald as a pass rusher, Jalen Ramsey at corner, and we'll make it work everywhere else.
Yeah.
The Patriots have never built that way because they're the greatest player of all time and they believed in balance across their roster. But it's really, really hard to win that way when you don't have Tom Brady pulling the trigger.
Albert Breer, the Monday morning quarterback. All right, let me run through some topics here.
Sure.
Whose call was it to draft Bryce Young, and what was Frank Reich saying at the press conference yesterday about his owner?
I mean, ultimately, I think it was David Tepper's call. Now, I do know that there was pretty strong agreement that Bryce Young was the correct pick at the time. And I can tell you, just having talked to Frank over the last, 4 or 5 months, he really likes Bryce as a player. There's a lot about him that Frank was enamored with before the draft. And so do I know that Frank absolutely positively loved Bryce Young over CJ Stroud? Maybe not, but I know he liked Bryce Young quite a bit.
But he might have had to do that because the owner really loved Bryce Young.
Yeah. But I would say I've got a pretty good sense for when someone's BSing me. I don't think Frank's BS'd me with that. Like when I've talked to him about it, at least. Like okay. I do think he really believes in Bryce Young. Again, doesn't mean he didn't like CJ Stroud also, but I do think he really liked Bryce Young. The idea that Tepper is overbearing is not new. The people who were there last year felt that way. The people in the front office have felt it. Wow. He is, and I think this is a credit to him. Okay. He runs his football team like he runs his other businesses, like he runs his hedge fund. And I think people who have worked for him would tell you that it's a high pressure environment. And I think he's applied that to running his football team. And I think what Frank said the other day reflects the way a lot of people have felt working for David Tepper. And in Tepper's defense, like I think the owners that apply their business principles to running their football team generally figure out a way to make it work, but it doesn't always happen right away. Like you brought up Robert Kraft, right? It took Robert Kraft a good 6 years to figure it out and hire Bill Belichick. And once they got rolling, they were rolling. But I mean, he screwed it up with Pete Carroll. Now, Pete Carroll wasn't Pete Carroll at that point either. It wasn't the Pete Carroll of USC or Seattle at that point. But it took Robert Kraft like a few years to figure it out. It's taken other owners who are really, really good. Jed York in San Francisco. I think people would tell you Jed York's done a really good job in facilitating and enabling guys like John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan and Parag Marathi and all the guys that run the show there, I think people would tell you like Jed's done a great job the last few years. He was not well liked
No.
by Jim Harbaugh, a decade ago,
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of these owners have to go through a process of figuring it out when they get in charge. And I think this was, all of this is part of the process of David Tepper getting there. And unfortunately, oftentimes there's collateral damage along the way. And it's not impossible to envision a scenario where this current regime could wind up being collateral damage.
Help me understand the Deshaun Watson situation with the Browns.
Yeah, they've changed a lot of things this year. I don't know if people realize that. Last year it was really awkward in that they were still running like the Kevin Stefanski offense that Kevin learned from Gary Kubiak, and that really worked for their offensive personnel before last year. And obviously with the run game with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt over the years, they produced, and Baker Mayfield got a great year out of it. What they found last year in putting that offense in for Deshaun Watson is that it didn't really work for Watson. And this is something Bill O'Brien went through in Houston too with Watson, in that he needs to be able to see the field and he's better out of the shotgun, and you have to involve him in the running game. And so, there was a process this year of getting him through that and saying, okay, we're going to build this offense for you. We're going to retrofit the Shanahan offense for you. They've gone through that now. And, I think in that game against Tennessee, they really felt like they hit on something. Like they harped to him in the building that week, completion driven, take the layups, just keep us on schedule, keep the ball moving. And, they got to a point where they felt really good. And then the injury sends it sideways. And it feels like everything has been a little sideways since he got there, even when it feels like that breakthrough was coming. And I know people internally felt like that breakthrough was there in the Tennessee game.
Yeah, but he
like
was medically cleared, though, Albert.
And that's the thing. And that's what I'm saying. The injury thing sort of sent that sideways where it's like, okay, he's medically cleared. And this is a tough thing because the two words pain tolerance, Dan, I've always felt like that's a term that's always been tough for players to swallow, but that's sort of what it was. It's like, can you get out there and function based on the amount of pain that you're going to be going through? And players hate coaches using that term because it calls into question their toughness. When the truth oftentimes is you're in too much pain to function where you can help the team, right? And that's sort of where Deshaun Watson was, where on that Friday, he could barely lift his arm above his shoulder. Come back Saturday, okay, he looks okay. We think he's going to be able to play. And then on Sunday, it's not where it was. So it's going to be very interesting seeing where they come out of their bye week. Today is obviously an important day because it's the first day of practice towards that. But, they really felt like they hit on something in that Tennessee game that was going to sort of straighten out Deshaun Watson and get Deshaun Watson where they envisioned him being when they gave up all that draft capital to go and get him a year and a half ago. And, now they've got what I think they hope is a speed bump. But, based on the evidence that we have right now, you'd have to be concerned, like, all right, like that was one good week. Is it going to be more than that?
All right, quickly, let me hit on this. Will teams call the Raiders about Devontae Adams? Will teams call the Vikings about Kirk Cousins?
Yes and yes. I don't think either gets moved for separate reasons. Kirk Cousins, I think it's more they have done a lot of things in Minnesota with their veterans. They've done such a nice job of keeping veterans happy as they've retooled the roster. Like you don't hear Dalvin Cook or Mike or Kendricks or any of the guys that have left there over the last year like saying bad things about that place. Patrick Peterson. They've managed a lot of these guys where they've had to retool the roster, and Harrison Smith accepted a pay cut. So a lot of guys have sort of swallowed it. And I think it would be tough for Kevin O'Connell to go back to the team and say, okay, now Nick Mullins is your starter, or okay, now Jaron Hall, a rookie 5th-round pick, is your starter. So I think that's why and I also am not sure that they would be able to get enough for Kirk Cousins to make it worth it. Devontae Adams is, I mean, plain and simple, they need to win there. Like, and they need it's all hands on deck there right now. They need to win, and they need to give the players in that locker room some proof of concept that what they're doing is right. So I think in both those situations, those guys stick with those teams. The team I would really watch as far as a potential seller as we get closer to the trade deadline could be Denver. I just think looking at where they're at, Sean Payton inherited a lot of that roster. They were listening on Jerry Jeudy. They were listening on Cortland Sutton back in the spring. Would a team give up a 1 for Jeudy? Would a team give up a 2 for Sutton? Would the Broncos listen on Garrett Bowles? And if they put themselves out there as a seller, is somebody going to come try to get Patrick Surtain? I think Denver's the team that's sort of in there, and I look at them and say, that's the team, that if there's a team that might be selling off some parts that isn't happy with where it's at, that wants to go through a little bit of reset, Denver would be the one, with Carolina maybe being another one laying out there in the weeds. Like, I'm sure they're going to get calls on Brian Burns as well.
Good to talk to you as always, Albert. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan.
Albert Breer, the Monday morning quarterback. And keep in mind what Denver gave up to Seattle to get Russell Wilson. So they need to sort of restock all those draft picks they gave up.